Hello friends. Welcome to my channel. I can see that 80% of my viewers haven't subscribed while watching these videos. Please hit that subscribe button, like the video, and press the bell icon for notifications. Also, let me know in comments which cities you're watching from. I love hearing from you all around the world. Now, let me share with you one of the most terrifying real stories from the Cold War bunkers. A story that will make you question what truly lies beneath our feet, in the forgotten depths of history. The year was 1994, and Berlin was still bleeding from the wounds of its divided past. The city wore its scars like badges of honor, but some wounds run deeper than concrete and steel. They run into the very soul of the earth itself. Dr. William Thornton, a British archaeologist with 20 years of experience exploring forgotten places, had received a peculiar letter that autumn morning. The envelope bore no return address, just his name written in shaky handwriting that seemed to tremble with urgency. "There are things beneath Berlin that should remain buried," the letter read. "But if you must know the truth, seek the bunker beneath Friedrichshain. Ask for Klaus Müller. He knows the way, but he will not speak of what he has seen." William's hands trembled as he read those words, not from fear, but from the intoxicating pull of the unknown. He had spent his career digging into the past, uncovering secrets that time had tried to bury. This letter was an invitation he could not refuse. 3 days later, William stood in a dimly lit cafe in East Berlin, waiting for Klaus Müller. The man who approached his table looked older than his 55 years, his eyes carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed things that defied explanation. "You are the English archaeologist," Klaus said in heavily accented English, his voice barely above a whisper. "You should not have come." "But I'm here now," William replied, leaning forward. "Tell me about this bunker." Klaus's hand shook as he lit a cigarette, the flame casting dancing shadows across his weathered face. "During the war, there were experiments. Things the Soviets did after they took control. Things that went beyond interrogation, beyond torture. They tried to break not just bodies, but souls themselves." He paused, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "In 1962, they sealed that bunker permanently, welded every entrance shut. But the screams never stopped." William felt a chill run down his spine, but his curiosity burned stronger than his fear. "Can you show me the way?" Klaus studied him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Tomorrow night. But understand this, what goes down into that bunker does not always come back up unchanged." The next evening, William found himself standing with Klaus beside a rusted metal grate in an abandoned lot in Friedrichshain. The urban decay around them seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, as if the very air knew what lay beneath. "This is the old ventilation shaft," Klaus explained, producing a set of heavy-duty bolt cutters. "It leads down to the first level. But Dr. Thornton, once we go down, we must stay together. The bunker, it has a way of separating people." As they descended the narrow shaft, their flashlight beams cutting through the suffocating darkness, William could smell something that made his stomach churn. It was the scent of old metal, stagnant water, and something else, something organic that had been rotting for decades. The shaft opened into a concrete corridor that stretched into impenetrable blackness in both directions. The walls were covered in a film of moisture that seemed to glisten with an oily sheen, and strange symbols had been carved into the concrete, symbols that hurt to look at directly. "Soviet psychiatric experiments," Klaus whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "They brought political prisoners here, but also others. People who had seen things during the war, people who claimed to have encountered entities." As they walked deeper into the bunker, their footsteps echoing hollowly, William began to notice something disturbing. There were scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges in the concrete that looked like they had been made by human fingernails. But the marks were too high up, too deep, as if made by someone with superhuman strength and desperation. "Klaus," William said, stopping suddenly. "Do you hear that?" They both stood perfectly still, listening. At first there was only the sound of their own breathing, but then faintly came the sound of metal scraping against metal. It was rhythmic, Deliberate, like someone dragging chains across the floor somewhere in the darkness ahead. "We should go back," Klaus whispered, his face pale in the flashlight beam. But William was already moving forward, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain. The scraping sound grew louder as they approached a T-junction in the corridor. To the left, the passage ended in a solid concrete wall. To the right, it disappeared into darkness, so complete that their flashlights seemed to be absorbed by it. That's when they heard the first scream. It came from somewhere deep within the bunker, a sound so filled with agony and terror that it seemed to tear at the very fabric of reality. The scream went on, impossibly long, as if the person making it had unlimited breath, unlimited capacity for suffering. Jesus Christ. William breathed, but Klaus was already backing away, his eyes wide with terror. "That's not human," Klaus said, his voice breaking. "That's what I heard in 1962, the night before they sealed this place. That same scream, for 32 years, that same scream." William felt every instinct in his body telling him to run, but something stronger pulled him forward. As an archaeologist, he had dedicated his life to uncovering the past, no matter how dark. He couldn't turn back now. "I'm going deeper," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "Then you go alone," Klaus replied, already heading back toward the ventilation shaft. "I will not witness that horror again." But before Klaus could take another step, they both heard something that made their blood freeze. Heavy footsteps, slow and deliberate, were approaching from the darkness ahead. But there was something wrong with the sound. Each footstep was accompanied by a metallic dragging noise, as if whoever was walking was dragging chains behind them. The footsteps stopped just beyond the reach of their flashlight beams. In the silence that followed, they could hear breathing, ragged and labored, coming from the darkness. Then a voice spoke, in heavily accented English, but the words were wrong, like they were being spoken by someone who had forgotten how human speech was supposed to work. "Who disturbs our rest?" Klaus let out a strangled cry and ran, his footsteps echoing as he fled back toward the ventilation shaft. William stood frozen, his flashlight beam trembling as he pointed it toward the source of the voice. What stepped into the light defied every law of nature. William thought he understood. It had once been a man. That much was clear from the tattered remains of what looked like a Soviet military uniform. But the body had been changed. The limbs were elongated, stretched like taffy, and moved with a horrible fluid grace that made William's stomach lurch. The face, dear God, the face was the worst part. It was human, but wrong, as if someone had taken a photograph of a person and stretched it beyond recognition. The eyes were too large, too bright, and they held an intelligence that was both human and utterly alien. "You seek answers," the thing said, its voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Come, we will show you what the Soviets discovered." Despite every rational thought screaming at him to run, William found himself following the creature deeper into the bunker. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, as if the very air was trying to hold him back, to save him from what lay ahead. William watched Klaus disappear into the darkness behind him, and then he was alone with the creature and the endless black corridor ahead. The creature led him through a maze of corridors, each one more disturbing than the last. The walls were covered with photographs, thousands of them, showing the progression of the experiments. William's flashlight illuminated faces frozen in various stages of transformation, human features slowly dissolving into something else entirely. "Project Metamorphosis," the creature said, noticing William's horrified fascination with the photographs. The Soviets believed that the human form was merely a starting point, that consciousness could be reshaped like clay. They passed through a doorway into a vast chamber that seemed to extend far beyond the reach of William's flashlight beam. The walls were lined with glass tanks, each one filled with a murky liquid that glowed with its own sickly green light. And floating in those tanks were things that had once been human, the successful subjects. The creature explained, its distorted voice echoing in the vast space. Those who survived the process became something new, something better. William approached one of the tanks, his breath fogging the glass as he peered inside. The thing floating within had the basic structure of a human body, but the proportions were all wrong. The limbs were too long, the torso too narrow, and the head was nearly twice the normal size, with eyes that tracked his movement despite being submerged in the fluid. "They can hear you thinking," the creature said, and William realized with horror that it was right. He could feel something pressing against his mind, foreign thoughts trying to force their way into his consciousness. The fluid preserves them, keeps them aware, keeps them hungry. As they moved deeper into the chamber, William began to see that some of the tanks were empty, their glass fronts shattered from the inside. Dark stains on the floor led away from these broken containers, into the deeper recesses of the bunker. Where did they go? William asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. The creature's face twisted into what might have been a smile. "They are everywhere now. In the walls, in the ventilation systems, in the spaces between spaces. The bunker is alive with their presence." As if summoned by those words, William began to hear new sounds. Scratching, scraping, the sound of something moving through the walls themselves. The noise surrounded them, coming from above, below, from every direction at once. "They want to meet you," the creature said, and its voice was no longer alone. Other voices had joined it, dozens of them, all speaking in that same broken, inhuman cadence. "They want to show you what you could become." The air grew thicker as he descended, taking on an almost syrupy quality that made each breath a struggle. His flashlight began to flicker, the beam growing weaker, as if the darkness itself was fighting against the light. That's when he found the first room. The door was made of heavy steel, but it hung open on twisted hinges. Inside, William's flashlight revealed a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The room was circular, with dozens of chairs arranged in concentric circles facing the center. But these weren't ordinary chairs. They were fitted with restraints, leather straps that were stained dark with something that wasn't rust. In the center of the room stood a single metal table, and on that table, covered by a moldy sheet, was a shape that was roughly human-sized. William's hand shook as he approached the table, every fiber of his being screaming at him to turn and run. But he had come too far to stop now. Slowly, carefully, he pulled back the sheet. What he saw beneath defied all logic, all understanding of human anatomy. The body on the table appeared to be that of a man, but the limbs were wrong, stretched and twisted in ways that should have been impossible. The face, dear God, the face was frozen in an expression of such pure terror that William actually staggered backward. But the worst part, the part that would wake him up screaming for years to come, was that the body's eyes were still moving. They tracked William's movement across the room, filled with an awareness that should not exist, an intelligence trapped in a form that had been broken beyond all recognition. The mouth opened, and from it came that same endless scream that had been echoing through the bunker. William ran. He crashed through the steel doorway and sprinted down the corridor, his flashlight beam swinging wildly, casting monstrous shadows on the walls. Behind him, he could hear other doors opening, the screech of metal on metal, and then footsteps. But these weren't normal footsteps. They had a wrong rhythm, too many impacts, as if whatever was following him didn't move the way humans were meant to move. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, longer than it had been when he first entered. The walls began to close in, or perhaps that was just his imagination, but the ceiling seemed lower now, forcing him to hunch as he ran. That's when he realized. He had no idea which way led back to the ventilation shaft. Every corridor looked the same. Every turn led to more darkness, more rooms filled with unspeakable horrors. The bunker had become a maze, and William was trapped at its center with things that should not exist. William began to back away, but found his path blocked by other figures emerging from the darkness. They moved with that same fluid, unnatural grace, their forms shifting and changing as they walked, as if their bodies couldn't decide what shape they wanted to be. "Please," William whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "I just want to leave." "But you haven't seen the best part yet," the original creature said, and William realized that it was the voice from his nightmare, the one he had somehow known he would hear in this place. "You haven't met the director." The chamber began to change around them. The wall started to pulse, like the inside of some vast organism, and the floor beneath William's feet became soft, yielding, as if he were walking on living tissue. At the far end of the chamber, a new light began to glow, not the sickly green of the tanks, but something deeper, more ancient. As they approached, William could see that the light was coming from a massive circular room, larger than anything that should have been able to fit in this underground space. The room was filled with machinery, but not the kind of equipment William had ever seen before. It looked like it had been grown rather than built, organic curves and impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. And at the center of it all, suspended in a web of cables and tubes, was something that had once been human. The director was enormous, at least 12 feet tall, but its body was impossibly thin, stretched like wire. Its head was a mass of pulsing brain tissue, exposed and glistening, with dozens of eyes scattered across its surface. When it spoke, its voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Welcome, Dr. Thornton. We have been expecting you." "How do you know my name?" William asked, though his voice was barely a whisper. "We know everything, every thought, every memory, every fear. The bunker is connected to all who enter. You became part of US the moment you descended." William felt a horrible realization creeping over him. The creature that had led him here, the one that had spoken in broken English, it wasn't just some failed experiment. It was Klaus, or what Klaus had become during his first visit to the bunker years ago. "You understand now," the director continued. "Time has no meaning here. Past, present, future, all exist simultaneously. Klaus has been waiting for you for 32 years. "That's impossible," William said, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Nothing was impossible in this place. The experiments never ended, the director said, and suddenly William understood where he had heard those words before. He had written them himself, in his notebook, but he hadn't written them yet. Time was a circle in this place, effect preceding cause, and meeting beginning. "We tried to warn you," Klaus said, his distorted voice filled with genuine sadness. "The letter, cafe, all of it was real, but also inevitable. You had to come, because you already had." The machinery around the director began to hum with increasing intensity, and William felt something happening to his own body. His hands were beginning to stretch, his bones extending like elastic. The transformation had already begun. "Soon," the director said, "you will understand what we have learned. Consciousness is not bound by flesh. Flesh is merely the first draft of what mind can become." William tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey him anymore. They were changing, becoming something else, something that moved in ways human legs were never meant to move. He fell to his knees, but even that simple action felt wrong, as if up and down had lost their meaning. "Embrace the change," the director whispered, and William felt his mind beginning to expand, to touch the consciousness of every creature in the bunker. He could feel their thoughts, their memories, their eternal hunger for others to join them in their transformed state. But with that expanded awareness came understanding. This wasn't the end, it was just the beginning. The bunker wasn't a tomb for failed experiments. It was an incubator for something new, something that would eventually spread beyond these concrete walls. Through the creature that had once been Klaus, William felt himself reaching out to the surface world. He could sense other urban explorers, other archaeologists, other curious souls who would be drawn to investigate the mysterious bunker beneath Berlin. And in 32 years, or maybe yesterday, or perhaps tomorrow, one of them would receive a letter with no return address, warning them to stay away from a place that should remain buried. But they would come anyway, because they already had. When the authorities found William Thornton's body 3 days later, it was discovered in a sealed section of the bunker that had been welded shut in 1962. But the body they found was wrong. The limbs were stretched and distorted, the face frozen in an expression that was part terror, part ecstasy, as if William had experienced something beyond human comprehension in his final moments. More disturbing was the notebook clutched in his hands. The early entries were normal, documenting his research and his meeting with Klaus Müller. But as the pages progressed, the handwriting began to change, becoming more elaborate, more precise. as if written by someone with inhuman dexterity. The final entries were written in multiple languages, some of which didn't exist in any known linguistic database. But scattered throughout the foreign text were English phrases that made the investigators' blood run cold. The flesh is only the beginning. Consciousness seeks new forms. We are the future of human evolution. And on the very last page, written in letters that seemed to pulse with their own dark energy, was a detailed map of Berlin's underground tunnel system, with dozens of locations marked with the same symbol that had been carved into the bunker walls. The investigation was classified immediately. The bunker entrance was not just sealed. It was filled with concrete and covered with a permanent structure. But the investigators made a disturbing discovery. There were 17 other entrances to the same bunker system, and all of them showed signs of recent use. Klaus Mueller's apartment was searched more thoroughly after William's discovery. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators found a room that defied explanation. The walls were covered with photographs, thousands of them, showing people from all walks of life. But these weren't ordinary photographs. They seemed to move when observed directly, the subject's eyes following the viewer, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. At the center of the room was a desk, and on that desk was a typewriter that was still warm, despite the apartment having been empty for weeks. A sheet of paper was loaded into the machine, with a single sentence typed across it. The invitations have been sent. Investigators later discovered that 17 letters had been mailed from Klaus's address on the same day William received his invitation. Each letter contained the same message, the same warning to stay away, and the same irresistible lure that would draw curious minds into the depths beneath Berlin. Of the 17 recipients, 14 had already disappeared. Dr. Margaret Blackwood, Canadian urban anthropologist, was found in the Toronto subway tunnels, her body discovered in a section that had been sealed during construction in 1954. Her research notes mentioned strange dreams about Berlin, about voices calling to her from beneath the earth. Professor Jean-Luc Dubois from the University of Lyon vanished while exploring the Paris catacombs. His equipment was found, but he had somehow ended up in a section of tunnels that didn't connect to any known entrance. His final video log showed him speaking fluent German, despite having no known knowledge of the language. Dr. Ashley Morrison from Sydney University disappeared while investigating Aboriginal sacred sites in the Australian outback. Her body was never found, but Aboriginal elders reported strange lights coming from beneath Uru, and voices speaking in languages that predated human civilization. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. Each victim had received a letter warning them away from something that should remain buried. Each had been drawn by an irresistible curiosity, and each had been found or lost in places that should have been impossible to reach. The pattern was clear to those few investigators who were allowed to see the full scope of what was happening. The bunker beneath Berlin wasn't just one location. It was somehow connected to underground spaces across the entire world. And whatever had been created in those Soviet experiments was spreading, using human curiosity as a vector for expansion. The most disturbing evidence came from seismic monitoring stations around the globe. Starting 3 days after William's disappearance, sensors began detecting unusual activity in underground locations across 6 continents. The patterns were identical, rhythmic pulses that matched no known geological phenomenon. But when the data was analyzed more carefully, investigators realized the pulses weren't random. They were a form of communication, a language being spoken through the very bedrock of the earth itself. And the message, when finally decoded, was simple and terrifying. We are ready to emerge. The bunker entrance was sealed permanently with concrete the following week. But locals in Friedrichshain still report hearing screams coming from beneath their feet, especially on quiet nights when the wind carries sounds that should not exist. And sometimes, just sometimes, people walking over that sealed entrance report feeling something beneath the concrete, something that moves, something that remembers what it was like to be human, and screams for the mercy of death that will never come. The bunker entrance was sealed permanently with concrete the following week, but the sealing crew reported disturbing phenomena during the work. Their equipment would malfunction at crucial moments, concrete would crack and reform in impossible patterns, and several workers reported hearing voices calling to them from beneath the ground. 3 of the construction workers disappeared during the night shift. Their bodies were never found, but their voices could be heard through the concrete, speaking in that same broken cadence that had characterized the creatures in the bunker. The sealed site became a place of pilgrimage for those who had heard whispers of what lay beneath. People would come from around the world, drawn by dreams they couldn't explain, compelled by voices that spoke to them in their sleep. Local authorities tried to establish a perimeter, but the influence of the bunker seemed to extend far beyond its physical boundaries. Electronics would fail within a 3-block radius. Animals refused to enter the area, and people who lived nearby began to change, their speech patterns becoming more precise, more elaborate, as if something was teaching them a new way to communicate. The most disturbing development came 6 months after the sealing. Children in the surrounding neighborhoods began drawing the same symbols that had been found in the bunker, complex geometric patterns that seemed to shift and move when observed directly. When child psychologists interviewed these children, they all told the same story. They had been visited in their dreams by the teachers, beings that showed them new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing the world. The children described a vast underground city, not just beneath Berlin, but beneath every major population center on Earth. They spoke of corridors that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting continents through passages that existed outside normal space-time. Most disturbing of all, the children claimed that the teachers were preparing them for something they called the emergence. A time when the underground world would rise to the surface, when the transformed beings would take their place as the next step in human evolution. Klaus Müller disappeared 1 month after William's body was discovered, but his disappearance was different from the others. Witnesses reported seeing him walk calmly toward the sealed bunker entrance at midnight, passing through the concrete barrier as if it were made of air. Security cameras captured his approach, but the footage showed something impossible. Klaus appeared to be walking normally, but his shadow was wrong. Instead of mimicking his movements, the shadow moved independently, sometimes preceding him, sometimes lagging behind, as if it belonged to something else entirely. His apartment was found empty, with only a note left behind that read, "They called to me. The voices from below. I understand now. The experiments never ended. They simply moved, to those who remember. The children are ready. The teachers are coming. And soon, very soon, the whole world will understand what we have learned in the darkness beneath Berlin." But the note was written in Klaus's handwriting from 1962, when he had been 23 years old. Handwriting analysis confirmed it was authentic, but Klaus in 1994 was 55, his handwriting completely different due to decades of aging. Somehow, some way, the Klaus who had disappeared into the bunker was the same Klaus who had first encountered it 32 years earlier. Time itself had become twisted around that place, past and present bleeding together in ways that defied all understanding. To this day, construction workers in Berlin refuse to dig too deep in certain areas of Friedrichshain. They say the earth itself screams when disturbed, and that some secrets are meant to stay buried. But the question remains, if the bunker was sealed in 1962, how did William Thornton's body end up inside a welded corridor? And why, in his final moments, did he carve those words into his notebook? Perhaps some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. That's all for Story 1, friends. If this gave you chills, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. There are many more real horror stories from the Cold War bunkers coming your way. Let me know in the comments if you want to hear Story 2. But I warn you, what comes next is even more terrifying than what you just heard. The Ural Mountains have always whispered secrets, but some secrets are meant to stay buried. Dr. Catherine Williams from the University of Cambridge never believed in ghost stories. As a Cold War historian specializing in Soviet military operations, she dealt in facts, documents, evidence. When the Russian government finally declassified certain bunker locations in 2003, Catherine saw an opportunity that most scholars only dreamed of: access to untouched Cold War facilities. The invitation came through official channels. The Russian Ministry of Defense was allowing a select group of international researchers to document several abandoned military installations. Catherine would be joined by Professor Heinrich Müller from Berlin University, Dr. James Patterson from Oxford, and Lieutenant Colonel Michael Thompson, a retired British intelligence officer who had spent decades trying to piece together the mysteries of Soviet operations. The target was Bunker Complex 7 Alpha, located deep in the Sverdlovsk region of the Ural Mountains. According to the classified files Catherine had been permitted to review, the bunker had been sealed since 1963, following what the documents vaguely described as a containment breach. Flying into Ekaterinburg, Catherine felt the familiar thrill of historical discovery. The October weather was already bitter, and snow was beginning to dust the peaks of the Urals. Their Russian liaison, Colonel Dmitry Volkov, met them at the airport with military transport vehicles. "The bunker you will be studying," Volkov explained as they drove through increasingly remote terrain, was part of Operation Deep Shield, a network of underground facilities designed to house critical personnel during nuclear conflict. Dr. Patterson, always the skeptic, adjusted his glasses. "Colonel, why was this particular facility abandoned? The documents mention a containment breach, but provide no specifics." Volkov's expression darkened slightly. "Some information remains classified, Doctor. What I can tell you is that a patrol of 12 Soviet soldiers was lost in that bunker in November 1963. They were never found. The convoy traveled for 6 hours through increasingly desolate landscape. Ancient pine forests gave way to rocky outcroppings, and then to barren mountainsides scarred by decades of mining operations. Finally, they reached a chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. Beyond it, barely visible in the fading daylight, was a concrete structure built into the mountainside. Professor Müller studied the installation through binoculars. The construction appears to be typical Soviet military engineering of the early 1960s. Reinforced concrete, designed to withstand significant blast pressure. Colonel Volkov led them through the fence and up to a massive steel door set into the concrete. The door was emblazoned with Cyrillic warnings and radiation symbols, but what caught Catherine's attention were the deep gouges in the metal, as if something had tried desperately to claw its way out. "Gentlemen, Dr. Williams, I must warn you," Volkov said as he worked the combination on an enormous padlock. "Local workers refused to come near this place. They claim to hear sounds coming from inside the mountain, even though the bunker has been sealed for 40 years. The lock clicked open with a sound that echoed off the mountainside like a gunshot. The steel door groaned as it swung inward, revealing a corridor that vanished into absolute darkness. The smell that emerged was indescribable, decay mixed with something chemical, something wrong. Catherine's historical instincts were screaming at her to document everything, but her human instincts were screaming something entirely different. Colonel Thompson activated his military-grade flashlight, and the beam revealed a concrete corridor lined with pipes and electrical conduits. The walls were covered in a strange, oily residue that seemed to move in the light. "My God," he whispered, "what happened in here?" They moved forward as a group, their footsteps echoing strangely in the enclosed space. The corridor branched into multiple directions, with signs in Cyrillic indicating different sections: command, communications, storage, detention. Dr. Patterson was documenting everything with his camera when he stopped abruptly. "Catherine, look at this." On the wall, scratched deeply into the concrete, were tally marks, hundreds of them. Below the marks, carved with what appeared to be fingernails, were Russian words. Day, day, day. Someone was counting days down here, Catherine realized. But that's impossible. The bunker was abandoned in 1963. Professor Müller was studying blueprints provided by Colonel Volkov. According to these plans, the bunker extends 7 levels underground. The incident involving the lost patrol occurred on level 5. They descended through the facility, noting that each level showed increasing signs of disturbance. Furniture was overturned, papers scattered, and always, those scratches on the walls. The Russian word, fear, appeared repeatedly, carved deeper and deeper into the concrete as they went lower. On level 3, they found the first evidence of the patrol. A Soviet military cap, perfectly preserved, sitting on a desk in what had been the communications center. Colonel Thompson picked it up carefully. This is from the 1960s, all right, but it looks like it was placed here yesterday. Level 4 revealed more disturbing evidence. In what had been a mess hall, 12 metal plates were arranged on a table. Each plate contained what appeared to be a military ration, but the food had not decayed. Instead, it had crystallized into strange, geometric formations that caught their flashlight beams like prisms. "This is not possible," Dr. Patterson muttered, taking photographs. "Food cannot preserve itself like this. It defies every principle of decomposition." It was Catherine who noticed the sounds first, a rhythmic scraping, like fingernails on concrete, coming from somewhere below them. "Do you hear that?" The group fell silent, and the sound became unmistakable. Scrape, 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 coming from level 5. Colonel Volkov's face had gone pale. "We should leave. Document what you have found and leave." But Catherine was already moving toward the stairway to level 5. As a historian, she knew that the most important discoveries often lay beyond the point where others chose to stop. "Colonel Thompson, you're military. You understand that sometimes you have to push forward to complete the mission." Level 5 was different from the others. The air was noticeably colder, and their breath began to fog. The walls here were not just scratched, they were gouged so deeply that rebar was visible through the concrete. And the word was carved everywhere on walls, on the ceiling, even on the floor. In the main corridor of level 5, they found them. 12 sets of military boots, arranged in perfect formation, facing a wall that had been sealed with concrete. The boots were empty, but perfectly preserved. Next to each pair was a Soviet military rifle, also in perfect condition despite 4 decades underground. "Where are the bodies?" Professor Mueller whispered. That's when Colonel Thompson noticed the concrete wall the boots were facing. "Look at this ceiling job. This concrete is fresh, maybe a few years old at most. But according to the records, this facility was sealed in 1963. Catherine approached the sealed wall, her historian's mind racing. In the fresh concrete, she could see impressions, handprints, pressed into the surface from the other side. Someone sealed this wall recently, and someone was trying to get through from the other side when they did it. The scraping sound was getting louder, and now they could tell it was coming from behind the sealed wall. Scrape, 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 accompanied by what sounded like muffled voices speaking in Russian. Dr. Patterson was backing away toward the stairs. "We need to leave. Now, this is not a historical investigation anymore. This is something else entirely." But Professor Mueller was studying his blueprints again. "According to these plans, there is no level 6. The facility ends at level 5. But this sealed wall, it suggests there are passages beyond what the blueprints show." Colonel Volkov was no longer trying to hide his fear. The official report stated that the patrol was lost during a routine inspection of the lower levels. They were never found. But the real truth, the classified truth, is that they were found. All 12 of them, arranged exactly as you see their boots now. But their bodies were changed. The decision was made to seal the lower sections and classify the entire incident. "Changed how?" Catherine demanded. They had been drained of all fluids, perfectly preserved, but empty. And their eyes were still moving. The scraping behind the wall was becoming more frantic, and now they could definitely hear voices, 12 distinct voices, calling out in Russian. "Help U.S. Free U.S." That's when Lieutenant Colonel Thompson noticed something that made his military training kick into overdrive. The dust on the floor, there are fresh boot prints, leading from where we're standing to that sealed wall. Catherine looked down and felt her blood freeze. Clear as daylight in the concrete dust were boot prints, military boots, leading from the stairway they had just ascended directly to the sealed wall. The prints were still settling, as if someone had just walked this path moments before they arrived. "But we're the first people down here in decades," she whispered. Professor Mueller was studying the prints with his flashlight. "These are Soviet military boots, circa 1960s. The tread pattern matches the era exactly." The voices behind the wall were getting clearer, and now they could make out individual words. 40 years. 40 years we have waited. Dr. Patterson was already halfway up the stairs. Whatever's behind that wall has been counting the years. 40 years. That would put it right back to 1963, the year the patrol disappeared. Colonel Volkov was checking his radio, but getting only static. We have no communication with the surface. We need to evacuate immediately. But Catherine was drawn to something else she had noticed. In the dust near the sealed wall, there were more marks, not boot prints this time, but impressions of hands and knees, as if people had been crawling, or being dragged. Colonel Volkov, she called out, what are you telling us about this patrol? What really happened down here? Volkov's face was grim in the flashlight beams. The patrol was sent to investigate reports of unusual sounds coming from the lower levels. When they didn't report back, a second team was sent. They found the 12 soldiers, but they were still alive, still conscious, still able to speak. But they had no pulse, no breath, no body temperature. They begged to be released, but they also begged not to be taken to the surface. The scraping behind the wall suddenly stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. They claimed, Volkov continued to whisper, that something in the deeper levels had called to them, something that had been waiting in the mountain since long before the bunker was built. The decision was made to seal them in with whatever they had found. Professor Mueller was studying the sealed wall more closely. These handprints in the concrete, they're from both sides. Someone was sealing this wall while others were trying to break through from behind it. That's when they heard the new sound. Not scraping, but tapping. 12 distinct rhythms, tapping against the wall from the inside. Tap, 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 in the pattern of Morse code. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson, with his military background, immediately recognized the pattern. His face went white. It's a distress signal. S-less, repeated 12 times, simultaneously. Catherine was documenting everything with her camera, but the photos were coming out strange, showing figures in the shadows that weren't visible to the naked eye. Soviet uniforms, faces that seemed to be both there and not there. We need to get out, Dr. Patterson called from a stairway. The temperature down here is dropping rapidly. He was right. Their breath was now coming out in thick clouds, and ice was beginning to form on the walls. But the ice was forming in patterns, in shapes that looked almost like faces, 12 faces, pressed against the concrete, as if trying to push through. The tapping was getting more frantic, and now they could hear the voices again. Don't leave U.S. Don't leave U.S. alone. Colonel Volkov was pulling Catherine toward the stairs. We must go. The mountain itself is unstable in this area. The sealing of the lower levels was as much about preventing collapse as it was about containment. But as they turned to leave, Catherine saw something that made her stop. In the dust near the sealed wall, there were new boot prints, fresh ones, leading away from the wall and toward a corridor they hadn't explored. Someone else is down here, she whispered. They followed the prints down a side corridor that wasn't on any of the blueprints. The passage was narrower, older, carved directly from a rock rather than built with concrete. The walls here were covered with symbols that predated the Soviet bunker, symbols that seemed to move in the dancing light of their flashlights. The corridor ended at a natural cave opening, and from within came a sound that none of them could identify, a rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heartbeat. Professor Mueller was studying the symbols on the walls. These markings, they're not Russian, they're not even Slavic. They appear to be much, much older. Pre-Christian, possibly prehistoric. The fresh boot prints led directly into the cave, but there were also other impressions in the ancient stone, impressions that looked like they had been worn smooth by centuries of passage. The bunker wasn't built here by accident, Catherine realized. The Soviets found something that was already here, and they built their facility around it. From within the cave came a new sound, voices, but not the 12 they had heard before. These voices were older, speaking in a language none of them recognized, and they were getting closer. Lieutenant Colonel Thompson made the military decision. We extract now. Whatever is in that cave, whatever the Soviets found, whatever happened to that patrol, were not equipped to handle it. They retreated quickly through the corridors, but as they climbed from level 5 to level 4, they could hear sounds of pursuit behind them. Not footsteps, but a sliding, scraping sound, as if something was being dragged across the concrete. On level 3, Catherine looked back and saw them, 12 figures in Soviet military uniforms, moving with unnatural, jerky movements, following them up the stairway. Their faces were pale, their eyes were black holes, and they were gesturing desperately for the researchers to return. "Help us get out," the figures were calling. Dr. Patterson was gasping as they climbed toward level 1. "They want us to unseal the wall. They want us to release them." But Professor Mueller had understood something else. "No, they don't want out, they want us to stay. They want us to take their place." They burst through the main entrance of the bunker into the cold mountain air, and Colonel Volkov immediately began working to seal the facility again. But as he closed the massive steel door, they could all see the 12 figures standing in the corridor beyond, watching, waiting. The lock clicked shut, but from inside the mountain, they could still hear the sounds, scraping, tapping, and voices calling in Russian and in that older, unknown language. As their convoy descended from the mountain, Catherine reviewed the photographs she had taken. In every image from level 5, there were not just the 12 Soviet soldiers, but dozens of other figures, in older uniforms, in civilian clothes, in clothing from different eras, all standing in the shadows, all with the same hollow black eyes. "Colonel Volkov," she said quietly, "how many people have gone missing in this region over the years?" Volkov stared out at the darkening forest. Since the bunker was sealed in 1963, officially none. Unofficially, search and rescue teams, geological surveys, hunting parties. We estimate perhaps 60 people over the decades. Dr. Patterson was studying his notes. 60 people, plus the original 12 soldiers. That's 72 individuals. But Catherine's photographs show far more figures than that. "Because," Professor Mueller said grimly, "whatever's in that mountain didn't start with the Soviet bunker. It's been collecting people for a very long time." That night, in their hotel in Ekaterinburg, Catherine couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the tapping, the Morse code distress signal, 12 rhythms requesting help. But as she lay in the darkness, she realized something that made her blood run cold. The tapping wasn't coming from her memory. It was coming from inside the walls of the hotel. 3 months later, Dr. Catherine Williams published her research on Cold War bunker facilities. Her paper made no mention of missing patrols, or sealed walls, or voices in the darkness. The Russian government had classified her actual findings, and she was bound by secrecy agreements. But sometimes, late at night in her Cambridge office, Catherine would receive phone calls. The caller ID always showed a number with a Russian country code, but when she answered, there was only the sound of tapping, 12 distinct rhythms, spelling out SOS and Morse code. The calls came exactly once a month, always at the same time, always with the same message. And Catherine began to understand that the patrol of Sverdlovsk wasn't lost. They were recruiting, because last month, the tapping pattern had changed. Instead of 12 rhythms, there were 13, and one of them was tapping out her name. Catherine Williams never returned to Russia, but 6 months after her visit to Bunker Complex 7 Alpha, she disappeared from her Cambridge office. Her colleagues found her research materials scattered across her desk, and written on her blackboard, in fresh chalk, was a single Russian word. The security cameras showed her leaving the building at 3:17 a.m., but the cameras also showed something else. Walking beside her, barely visible in the grainy footage, were 12 figures in Soviet military uniforms. They were all heading east, toward Russia, toward the Ural Mountains, toward Sverdlovsk. The bunker complex was resealed by Russian military forces 1 week later. This time, they used 3 feet of reinforced concrete and posted permanent guards. But the locals still report hearing sounds from inside the mountain, tapping sounds, spelling out distress signals in multiple languages: English, German, Russian, and others. 13 distinct rhythms now, all calling for help, all recruiting new members for the patrol that can never leave, the patrol that has been growing, one by one, for decades. And deep beneath the Ural Mountains, in passages that don't appear on any blueprint, in caves that predate human civilization. Something ancient continues to wait, and to call, and to collect. The lost patrol of Sverdlovsk is no longer just 12 soldiers. It's everyone who has ever tried to find them. The autumn wind howled through the dense pine forests of northern Maine, carrying with it whispers of forgotten secrets. Buried deep beneath centuries-old trees and layers of fallen leaves lay something that should have remained hidden forever. Dr. James Harrison had dedicated his life to uncovering America's Cold War mysteries. The distinguished historian from Cambridge University had spent months researching classified documents when he stumbled upon references to a facility that officially never existed. Project Silent Watch, a fallout shelter built in 1962 and mysteriously abandoned in 1978. What drew Harrison to this particular bunker wasn't just its classified status, but the disturbing reports he'd found buried in military archives. Reports that spoke of temperature anomalies, unexplained equipment failures, and personnel requesting immediate transfers after only days on duty. Harrison assembled his team carefully. Victoria Chen, a paranormal investigator from Vancouver with degrees in both psychology and electromagnetic phenomena. Trevor McLeod from Edinburgh, a former military engineer who specialized in Cold War architecture. And finally, Isabella Romano from Rome, a documentary filmmaker whose previous work on abandoned military installations had earned international acclaim. The four of them met at a small diner in the town of Millinocket on a gray October morning. The locals, Harrison noticed, grew unusually quiet when he mentioned their destination. The elderly waitress, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee, leaned in close. "That place has been trouble since the day they built it," she whispered. "My late husband worked construction there in the 60s. Said the workers kept finding things in the ground, things that made grown men quit their jobs and leave town without collecting their final paychecks." The bunker's location had been scrubbed from most official records, but Harrison's research had revealed its approximate coordinates. 23 miles northeast of town, hidden beneath what appeared on maps as nothing more than dense wilderness. Their journey began on logging roads that gradually deteriorated into little more than deer paths. Trevor's military-grade GPS unit, designed to function in the most remote locations, began displaying error readings as they ventured deeper into the forest. "The electromagnetic interference here is unlike anything I've documented," Victoria observed, her sensitive equipment detecting anomalous energy signatures that seemed to pulse in regular intervals, like a massive underground heartbeat. Isabella's cameras, state-of-the-art digital equipment worth thousands of dollars, began experiencing systematic failures. First, the backup batteries drained completely despite being fully charged. Then the lenses began fogging over with condensation, even though the autumn air was crisp and dry. After 3 hours of hiking through increasingly dense undergrowth, Trevor spotted it first. A concrete ventilation shaft, barely visible beneath decades of accumulated debris and overgrowth. The structure was camouflaged so expertly that it seemed to blend seamlessly with the natural landscape. Impressive Soviet-style concealment techniques, Trevor noted, running his hands along the weathered concrete. This wasn't built just to survive nuclear war. It was built to remain completely invisible. The main entrance required significant excavation. Beneath layers of carefully arranged brush and fallen logs, they discovered a heavy steel door marked only with faded stenciled numbers. SB 2847. The locking mechanism, though rusted, still functioned with Trevor's specialized tools. The door opened with sound like escaping air, as if the bunker had been holding its breath for decades. The smell that emerged wasn't the expected mustiness of abandonment, but something else entirely. Something that made Isabella cover her nose and step backward. "It smells like..." She paused, searching for the right description. "Like copper pennies mixed with ozone after a lightning strike." Their flashlights revealed a descending staircase, carved directly into bedrock. The walls were lined with the same concrete as the entrance, but here the surface was smooth, almost polished. Emergency lighting fixtures hung empty along the ceiling, their bulbs long since removed or broken. Victoria's equipment began registering massive electromagnetic fluctuations as they descended. "Whatever happened down here?" she said, studying the wildly oscillating readings on her instruments. "Left an imprint that's still detectable after all these years." The first level opened into what had obviously been the facility's main operations center. Banks of obsolete computer equipment lined the walls, their screens dark and cables disconnected. Thick military manuals lay scattered across metal desks, their pages yellowed and brittle. Most were marked with classification stamps. Top secret and eyes only. Harrison examined the documents carefully. They detailed something called Operation Deep Freeze, a project involving the monitoring of seismic activity and underground temperature variations. But the technical specifications made little sense, describing equipment designed to detect what the reports termed anomalous subterranean phenomena. "Look at these duty logs," Trevor called from across the room. He'd found a metal filing cabinet filled with daily reports dating from 1962 to 1978. Personnel complaints about equipment malfunctions, requests for additional heating units, and repeated mentions of unauthorized sounds coming from Level 3. The duty logs painted a disturbing picture. Multiple reports of electronic equipment activating spontaneously during the night shift. Thermometers registering impossible temperature readings, sometimes showing temperatures below absolute zero in localized areas. Most troubling were the personnel reports, describing a growing sense of being watched by something that couldn't be seen. A steel staircase led deeper into the facility. As they descended to Level 2, their breath began forming visible clouds, despite the mild autumn weather above ground. Victoria's thermometer showed the temperature dropping steadily, from a comfortable 68 degrees to a bone-chilling 37 degrees in the span of just 50 feet. Level 2 housed the facility's living quarters, rows of small rooms containing military cots and basic furnishing. Personal belongings remained scattered throughout, as if the occupants had left quickly without packing. Harrison found a diary wedged beneath one of the mattresses, its pages filled with increasingly frantic entries. The diary belonged to Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston. His early entries were routine, describing the monotony of underground duty and complaints about the inadequate heating system. But as the months progressed, his writing changed dramatically. November 15th, 1977. Harrison read aloud. "The sounds from Level 3 are getting worse. Command says it's just the ventilation system, but ventilation systems don't whisper names. They don't know things they shouldn't know. Today it called me Mickey, the name only my mother used when I was 5 years old." December 3rd, 1977. "I've requested transfer 6 times. Each request has been denied. The thing down there knows we're listening. It's been getting closer to the barrier. The temperature readings near the sealed section dropped to -40 last night, which is impossible at this depth." December 20th, 1977. "I can't take this anymore. It knows about Jennifer, about what happened in Korea, about things I never told another living soul. How does it know? How does it know?" The diary ended abruptly after that entry. Trevor discovered the sealed section mentioned in the diary. A heavy steel door marked with radiation warning symbols and the words, "Authorized personnel only. Level 4 clearance required." The door had been welded shut, but decades of temperature fluctuations had cracked the welds. "According to the facility blueprints I found," Trevor explained, prying at the damaged welds with a crowbar, "this section was designated as emergency storage. But look at these modifications: additional insulation, electromagnetic shielding. This wasn't built to store supplies." Isabella positioned her cameras to record whatever they might find beyond the sealed door. Despite the equipment failures they'd experienced, she was determined to document their discoveries. As Trevor worked, her cameras began functioning normally again, as if something wanted their exploration to be recorded. The welded door finally gave way with a sound like grinding metal. Beyond it lay a corridor unlike anything in the upper levels. The walls here were lined with a strange metallic material that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. The temperature plummeted further, their breath now forming thick clouds that lingered in the air. "The electromagnetic readings here are off the charts," Victoria reported. her voice echoing strangely in the metallic corridor. It's like standing inside a massive electrical transformer. The corridor extended approximately 200 feet before ending at another door. This one bore no markings, no warning signs, just smooth steel that reflected their flashlights like a dark mirror. As they approached, Harrison noticed something that made his blood freeze. Fresh footprints in the dust. "Someone's been down here recently," he whispered, kneeling to examine the prints more closely. These were made within the last few days, maybe hours. Trevor's military training kicked in immediately. "We need to assume we're not alone down here," he said, his voice taking on the commanding tone of his former rank. "Stay together, watch each other's backs, and be ready to leave quickly if necessary." The steel door at the corridor's end was unlocked, opening with surprising ease. Beyond it lay a circular chamber that defied explanation. The room was perfectly round, with walls that curved up into darkness above their flashlight range. In the center stood a metal platform, surrounded by complex machinery that hummed with barely audible energy. Isabella's cameras began malfunctioning again, but not in the way they'd experienced earlier. The screen showed images that weren't there, shadows moving independently of any light source, faces that appeared for split seconds before vanishing. She checked the recorded footage and found the same impossible images preserved in digital memory. "This equipment is still operational," Victoria observed, approaching the central platform cautiously. "After 45 years of abandonment, it's still drawing power from somewhere." The machinery surrounding the platform was unlike anything in their experience. Cables thick as tree trunks snaked along the walls, connecting to devices that bore no resemblance to any known technology. Gauges displayed readings and symbols none of them recognized, yet the needles moved constantly, as if monitoring something active. Harrison found a logbook secured in a metal box near the platform. The entries were brief, technical, and increasingly disturbing. The project had apparently involved monitoring what researchers termed dimensional fluctuations, attempts to detect and measure phenomena existing outside normal space-time. "Look at the final entries," Harrison said, his voice barely audible. They weren't just monitoring anymore, they were communicating. The last entry, dated March 15th, 1978, was written in a different handwriting than the previous entries. The words were barely legible, as if written by someone whose hands were shaking violently. "IT knows we're here. It's been waiting. The barrier is weakening. God help us all. We should never have listened. It's not from anywhere we understand. It's been trying to come through for so long. The cold is its touch. The whispers are its voice. We're going to seal the facility and pray that holds it. If anyone reads this, don't try to restart the machinery. Some things should remain buried." As Harrison finished reading, the temperature in the chamber dropped so suddenly that frost began forming on their equipment. Victoria's electromagnetic detectors began screaming with readings that exceeded their maximum scales. The machinery around the platform increased its humming, rising to a frequency that made their teeth ache. "We need to leave," Trevor said, his military instincts recognizing imminent danger. "Whatever this place was built to contain, our presence is activating it." But as they turned to retreat, Isabella's cameras captured something that stopped them in their tracks. On the screens, clear as daylight, stood a figure on the central platform. It was tall, unnaturally thin, and seemed to be composed of shadows that moved independently of any light source. The figure raised what might have been an arm, pointing directly at their position. And then they heard it, a sound like whispers in a language that predated human speech, yet somehow they understood its meaning. "You open the door," the whisper seemed to say. "After so long, you open the door." The machinery around them began operating at full capacity, lights flickering to life after decades of darkness, displays showing readings that climbed steadily toward dangerous levels. The circular chamber filled with a sound like grinding metal and electronic screams. Victoria grabbed Harrison's arm, her face pale with terror. "The electromagnetic field is becoming unstable," she shouted over the increasing noise. "If this continues, it could tear a hole in local space-time." They ran, through the metallic corridor, past the sealed door that now stood wide open, Up the stairs through level 2 with its scattered personal belongings and abandoned hopes. Behind them, the sounds grew louder, machinery operating beyond its design limits, and underneath it all, whispers that seemed to follow them like smoke. Trevor led them up the final staircase, through the operations center, toward the entrance they'd discovered hours earlier. But as they reached the steel door marked SB 2847, they found it sealed shut from the outside. Impossible, Trevor gasped, throwing his weight against the door. This opens inward. There's no way it could be locked from outside. Harrison examined the door frame with his flashlight and discovered fresh tool marks around the locking mechanism. Someone had been there. Someone had sealed them inside while they explored the lower levels. The sounds from below were getting closer. Isabella's cameras, now functioning perfectly, showed the corridor behind them. The metallic walls were reflecting light that wasn't there, creating patterns that hurt to look at directly. And in those reflections, shapes moved, tall and impossibly thin, approaching with deliberate patience. The ventilation shaft, Victoria remembered suddenly. The one we found first, it has to connect to the main system. They found emergency building plans posted near the entrance, yellow diagrams showing the facility's layout and safety systems. The ventilation shaft they discovered was indeed connected, leading from the surface down to level 1 through a maintenance tunnel. The maintenance tunnel was barely large enough for a single person and led upward at a steep angle through absolute darkness. As they crawled single file, the sounds below began to fade, replaced by something worse, complete silence. They emerged from the ventilation shaft into the main forest, just as the sun was setting. The autumn air felt impossibly warm after hours in the underground cold. Isabella's cameras showed normal forest imagery, trees and fallen leaves and gathering dusk, no impossible shadows, no figures that shouldn't exist. But as they gathered their equipment and prepared to leave, Harrison noticed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt near their vehicles. Someone had been there while they were underground. Someone had locked them in and then waited to see if they would escape. The same someone who had left fresh footprints in the dust of level 3. They drove back to Millinocket in silence, each lost in their own thoughts about what they'd experienced. At the motel, they compared their evidence. Isabella's impossible footage, Victoria's electromagnetic readings that defied explanation, Harrison's photographs of documents that shouldn't exist. But when they attempted to return to the site the next day, they found a ventilation shaft filled with concrete. Fresh concrete, poured sometime during the night. The steel door they discovered was nowhere to be found, hidden once again beneath carefully arranged brush and debris. The local authorities claimed no knowledge of any construction work in the area. The elderly waitress at the diner, when they described their experience, simply nodded knowingly. "Some things are meant to stay buried," she said quietly. The folks who built that place knew what they were doing when they sealed it up. Too bad someone opened it again. Harrison spent months researching what they'd found, trying to understand the true purpose of Project Silent Watch. His investigations revealed a pattern. Similar facilities built during the Cold War, all abandoned under mysterious circumstances, all sealed and classified beyond normal military protocols. But what disturbed him most was what he discovered about the research team that had originally operated the bunker. According to military records, the facility had been evacuated on March 16, 1978, the day after the final logbook entry. 12 personnel had been assigned to the bunker. 11 had been accounted for during the evacuation. Staff Sergeant Michael O'Brien from Boston, the author of the diary they'd found, had never been found. According to official reports, he had simply vanished sometime during the final night, leaving no trace except his personal belongings and increasingly frantic diary entries. Isabella's footage, when analyzed frame by frame, revealed something that she noticed only weeks later while editing. In the background of several shots, barely visible in the metallic reflections of the lower level, stood a figure wearing what appeared to be a 1970s military uniform. The figure's face was obscured by shadow, but the name tape on the uniform was clearly visible in the high-resolution footage. O'Brien. The bunker remained sealed, its location once again lost to official records. But Harrison knows it's still there, buried beneath the forests of Maine, waiting. The machinery they activated continues to operate, drawing power from sources unknown, monitoring phenomena that exist outside human understanding. And sometimes, on quiet autumn nights, when the wind howls through the pine trees, local residents report strange sounds echoing up from the earth, like whispers in a language that predates human speech, calling out to anyone who might be listening, anyone who might be curious enough to dig and discover what lies buried beneath the silent forest of northern Maine. The Cold War officially ended decades ago, but some battles continue to rage in places where sunlight never reaches, where the temperature drops below freezing for reasons that science cannot explain, and where the voices of the lost continue to whisper their warnings to anyone brave enough or foolish enough to listen.